Just a heads up, this video is going to be a bit on the longer side because we're going to cover lots of information here. And what we're going to talk about is the historical figurehead of Islam, a man by the name of Muhammad bin Abdullah, who was born in 570 in a city by the name of Mecca, which is one of those main trading cities we just talked about. And if you scroll back two different maps or two slides back, you'll see where it is. He is an orphaned child of Bedouin herders and merchants who was raised in Mecca by his uncle and his grandfather. And as a young man, he works as a caravan manager, as a merchant, as a trader, and he's employed by a wealthy widow by the name of Khadijah. He ends up marrying her in 595, so when he's 25 years old, and remains married to her alone for the next 25 years. She dies after that point, and he marries a whole variety of women after that. And we'll get to those more marriages in a little bit. Mecca is particularly important because of its fairs with goods from Africa and the Far East, things like cloth and leather and slaves that make their way to the north, and coming from the north, things like wine and grains and weapons. And Mecca becomes this big cosmopolitan, that means universe polis, city where, think about it just like we've talked about in class, big cities tend to have lots of different people with lots of different ideas, and they tend to not have the same type of family loyalties you'd find in rural places. So what that means is that tribal loyalties that are the basis of Bedouin civilization are really weakened as lots of different people, including foreigners and exiles and slaves, congregate in places like Mecca. By 30, Muhammad is established as a respectful and a successful merchant. He lives well in Arabian society. But around the year 610 AD, when he's 40 years old, he claims to have had a spiritual experience that changes his life and leaves a really profound mark on world history. He's this merchant, he's living a good life, and he looks around and he recognizes that the world he grew up in, this Bedouin world, has a different set of values and cultures than what is being practiced by really wealthy, affluent, elite people in Mecca itself. And he decides to think on this, and the way he thinks on it is the way that lots of individuals in this time period and 100 years beforehand did. He leaves society and he goes and he meditates. So what he ends up doing is he makes a journey into the desert and wanders, fasts, and meditates in a cave. And this is something that we see in a whole variety of different contexts, but something that is very similar to Christian ideals that are being spread in this period. While he's in that cave, he claims to experience a vision from an angel by the name of Gabriel. And if that name sounds familiar to any of you, Gabriel is the angel that is apparently used in both the Old and the New Testament as a messenger. He appears in the Old Testament to Daniel. In the New Testament, he foretells the birth of John the Baptist and of Jesus. And the month in which Muhammad receives this revelation, apparently, becomes known as Ramadan, which is one of the holiest months in the Islamic calendar. In this vision, Muhammad claims that Gabriel instructs him to spread the word of God, or in Arabic, Allah. So Muhammad returns to Mecca, sets himself up as a teacher, a prophet, and doesn't really start this in earnest. Most sources agree that it takes him about 3 years to really take up this role completely. It's important for us to understand what's going on more broadly. So most Arabs at this time are polytheistic. They believe in a whole variety of gods. There's also large communities of Jewish merchants there. A lot of people had converted to Christianity by this time. And what Muhammad does is he says, I accept the authority of the Jewish and Christian prophets, folks that we haven't talked about in this class but might sound familiar to you, people like Abraham and Moses and Jesus. He holds the Torah, which is the Jewish version of the Holy Book, the Christian Bible, in high esteem. And he teaches that Allah, this God that he's received a vision from, is the same thing as the Jewish Yahweh, the same thing as the Christian God. And he explains that Gabriel had revealed to him that Allah had created and ruled the universe and prohibited the worship of other gods. Allah had also given mankind free will, and everybody who submits to the authority of God, to the authority of Allah, and leads a good moral life in accordance with the teachings of this God, will be rewarded with happiness on earth and with a pathway to a prosperous afterlife. You may notice that I don't have an image of Muhammad here, and that's because images displaying Muhammad are seen as sacrilegious to individuals of the Islamic faith. It's gotten a lot of people in trouble over time. Instead, what I have is a chart that shows Muhammad's ancestry, going back to the biblical idea of the first man, Adam, and working its way through people like Noah and Abraham. And there you might see a little bit of a split if you look closely, where Abraham has apparently 2 sons, and on one side, through his son Ishmael, all Arabs are descended. Okay, we've still got some time to go here on this slide, so take a little break if you need, otherwise power on through. By 620, Muhammad has a small but really devout following in Mecca. But the ruling elites don't like him, because he's saying everybody who's focused on wealth and everybody who's focused on making themselves better has abandoned traditional values. They aren't living a good life. And so because he has problems with that affluent Arabic society, a bunch of those merchants basically beat him up and kick him out of the town. And he flees to a city by the name of Yathrib. Later it's renamed Medina, which means the city of the Prophet, in 622. This movement is called the Hegira, Hegira. And for Muslims, this marks the beginning of their calendar. For them, this is year 0. It's the most important event in history, kind of like people in Christian societies mark more or less the birth of Jesus as the year 0. People in Medina welcome him. He's a good merchant. He knows what's up. He seems to be pretty popular. He's got great organizational leadership. He seems to have good spiritual ideas. And while he's there, he organizes folks into a tight-knit community. And the term for this is the Ummah. And the people who inhabit this community are known as the Sahaba. It means companions. They're largely illiterate. When they do learn to read and write, it comes from the outside, probably from slaves, prisoners of war. And while he's there, he marries several women, either widows of Muslims who've been killed in battle, or women who are in families that Muhammad wants as allies. This is a really standard tactic of powerful, expansive leaders. Over the next 8 years, he becomes popular. He gets lots of followers, and in 630, he takes those followers and marches back to Mecca with a really powerful army. There's apparently about 10,000 people. They conquer, they capture the city, they kick out the ruling elite, they destroy all the shrines and pagan monuments that are there. They replace them with mosques for community prayer. The one exception is something that is in the next slide, known as the Kaaba. It is a black stone that, according to tradition, was given to Adam when he was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. It was originally white, and when people or pilgrims touch it, it's said to have absorbed their sins, which made it black. I like to think of the rock where all seniors sign their names outside of my building as Ferrum's version of the Kaaba. And from Mecca, he ends up launching a very successful military campaign, or series of campaigns, against other towns, against other Bedouin clans. And by his death in 632, he had brought most of the Arabian Peninsula under his control. So on the next slide, I've got an example, or an image rather, of the Kaaba actually hidden underneath some really expensive black velvet. I've got a map that shows not only the path of the Hegira, but also the area that Muhammad had conquered. And then at the bottom, I've got an example of what this evolves into, which is the notion of Hajj, or that every Muslim who is able to should also undertake a journey to Mecca, kind of in remembrance of what Muhammad himself does. So nothing on the next slide, then we'll go to the 5 pillars of Islam on the following slide.